In one hand, Joe Schmoe held a dagger with a bejeweled hilt. The blade did not want to be attached to the handle, writhing like an agonized snake and lost in its caprices. At one moment solid, at another ghostly mist. In his opposite hand, Joe held an old phone, still in working condition. He replaced it because he wanted to play with more bells and whistles. Joe dragged the blade through his phone. The way Joe perceived the phone and its physical characteristics remained the same. However, he was entirely convinced that he was holding a rock, a completely uninteresting object that could blend in nearly anywhere you put it. He only continued to call the phone a phone because he knew this was the proper way of referring to it. When a person gazed at an object, they evaluated the physical, empirical qualities of it and matched these data to an idea stored in their brain. Constructing this idea, this category, required a person to perceive many objects with similar qualities, and a retinue of emotions and expectations surrounded every category. No object could hold every quality which defined a category. When a label was attached to an object, it was an approximation, never a perfect fit. Due to the way human minds worked, there was an obligation for physical characteristics and categories to connect. Joe's dagger could interrupt the link. With the obligation severed, Joe could make an object defy all categorization or stick it into any group he wanted. Just what he needed to solve his problem. Joe turned the dagger around, pointing the blade at his stomach. His hands trembled. The blade approached, but when the tip was just a few inches from his gut, right when he was at the cusp of victory, Joe moved his dagger away. Steam vented from a high-pressure engine and left behind cold machinery made purely of self-disgust. Contemplating the dagger had become a more regular occurrence, and this coincided with his friend Victor Triumphant's increasing insistence on forming the twin daggers. It was a trite, childish waste of time, but Victor couldn't get that through his thick skull. The blade of Joe's dagger vanished, and he slipped the hilt into his pocket. Trading his ruminations for his car, he hit the road. Half of an hour later, he reached his destination, the estate of a dead writer. Henrietta Gage's closest heir was her cousin, but her cousin didn't want to deal with the estate, so she sold it. The company which bought the manor turned it into a museum to provide everyone with a look into the life of this well-known wordsmith. A long, narrow road, hemmed in by bushes and trees, separated the main road from the estate. The vegetation was so well established that Joe had not been able to see the manor until reaching the end of the sinuous road. Gage had designed her home to look like a knoll, a natural, smooth shape bereft of the orthogonal obsession that typified mankind's dominance over the natural world. Grass covered most of it, and the rocky, jutting portions tended to have thick moss and climbing plants growing upon them. A window, a door, every now and then evidence of human habitation protruded from the mass of earth, of foliage. Flora and geometry obscured these unnatural markings as much as possible without blocking them completely, making them look like discarded pieces of refitted homes rather than parts of a rich woman's manifested ego. Joe got out of his car to greet his friend Victor, who had been waiting for him.
Late as always, but not as late as before.
I'm getting better.
Credit's where credit's due. You excited for this?
Yeah, sure.
In all honesty, this midden made Joe want to turn up his lip. This pile of detritus was the product of an endless game of attributing value to objects, because very few people had said objects. However, Joe was happy that Victor's wish was finally coming true. It had taken damn long to secure those tickets. Joe and Victor walked to the gate entrance, where the tour guide and group were waiting for them. The max size of a group was 10, so with the last two in attendance, security opened the way. They headed into the manor, and Joe was surprised by what it looked like on the inside. "I want the finest blocks of stone you can find," Gage had said many years ago. "Darkened lights, igneous and metamorphic, obsidian, marble, gneiss, pegmatite, suavite. I want a nice spread." And she had taken these rocks and made them into beams of equal thickness and unequal length. Stacked and laid, length to length, some poking from the walls, ceiling and floor, while others were recessed to create pockets, stratified like canyon walls. The tour guide led the group to the second door on the right, past the stairwell entrance. A metal ring was in the middle of the kitchen, and a slice had been removed from it to fit a sink. To heat the ring, a cook burned wood underneath it in a stone enclosure, and tubing carried the gases out of the building while pumping fresh air in. Refrigeration units, cupboards, and pantries lined the entire perimeter. It was enough storage space to feed an entire legion. As the tour guide spoke, a chill ran through Joe. He turned his gaze toward a woman in the group. She wore a black denim coat and a baseball cap, and her hair was bound in a ponytail. Everybody else in the group had come with friends, but this woman was solo. It wasn't truly Joe who had detected that something was amiss. It was the dagger, and since he was connected to it on a fundamental level, it could relay this detection to him. When the dagger severed the link between empirical qualities in a category, it consumed the chain. But all chains weren't created equal, and the dagger wanted to grow fat on the highest quality irons. This meant the situation was of substantial interest.
I know that look.
Victor nudged him in the ribs.
What are you talking about?
Follow it. You know what we're trying to do? Maybe this will be our big break.
I don't care about that kind of stuff.
But I do. And I'm your friend.
Victor jabbed Joe again.
Just listen to your blade, okay? See what that woman's all about.
With a sigh, Joe activated the camera hidden in his coat. He then headed toward the woman, but the way he moved lacked determination. Joe's eyes did not stay in one spot, and his path was meandering. It was as if he were examining the various objects in the room. A couple others were moving in a similar fashion, as the tour guide explained and pointed things out. As he drew closer, Joe clenched his teeth harder and harder. Joe didn't know what to say or what the dagger was seeing in her. This would be awkward to an unholy degree as he probed for information. Maybe he should continue past the woman, make a circuitous route back to Victor, and offer a lame excuse for...
Hello, my name is Joe.
He stopped beside the woman.
Plain Jane, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah.
Joe turned his gaze back to the tour guide. In his periphery, he saw that Jane was looking at him with a curious expression. Joe dug around in his mind for something to say. There was still time. The woman moved to the door they entered through. She pulled something out of her pocket. No, not something. It was a globe of restless, wriggling mist, and she threw it at the center of the room. Joe covered his face from the blast of moisture. By the time he brought his arm down, Jane was gone. The fog was settling, and everyone was scanning the room with wide eyes, too confused to speak. Everyone but Victor. He was approaching Joe with heavy steps and a deep scowl.
What the hell was that?
I didn't want to make a scene. I was thinking of the best approach.
Well, you should have thought harder than that. Cause look what happened.
I'm sorry that I let her get away, but security will handle the problem. Everything will be fine. Calm down, man.
Victor shook his head.
A life without fame isn't a life worth living. Now's our time to shine, to propel ourselves from the shadows into the public light. We will handle this on our own.
There's nothing wrong with chilling and enjoying life without responsibility. You know what I'm saying?
Do you have no ambition?
Sure I do. The ambition to be left alone.
More like the ambition to be a parasite to society.
That's not true. I don't want to do anything, but I'll do what I need to, and I don't think we need to be doing this. I don't want the baggage that goes along with your dreams.
Joe, you've been training your whole life. You're good enough. It was my fault I let you doubt yourself for too long. Scared to push you, and look where it's gotten us. We have a serious problem on our... What?
Victor winced, and so too did Joe. It was as if a hand was grasping his throat, as if its skin and muscle had suddenly lignified. Joe also felt something lift from him, some integral piece liberated without his volition.
What just happened?
Triumphant rubbed his throat to massage away the lingering woes of that brief episode.
All I can say is that the woman used her blade and that something is missing from my thought processes.
Triumphant raised his brows.
Sounds like a good reason to... You know.
Fine. Let's take care of this.
The boy. Let's do this. Joe, figure out what she's done. Turn to your dagger. See what's missing.
Joe closed his eyes, focusing on the potential links his dagger could consume, and he was astounded. The food his dagger could feed upon was now stratified rather than a soup of choice. 2 layers with a completely different feel. The new layer was beyond Joe's reach and puissant. Ambrosia his dagger desperately pined for. Joe told his friend what he had learned.
Oh, shit. I didn't know that was possible. We need to stop her. Fast!
But how did they do that when they didn't understand how to exit? Right now, Joe felt as if he were in a room with a continuous wall and interesting paint job. But he knew there were 2 doors that led to this room, and he knew where they were because he remembered entering through one of them. Had Joe been a normal person, one with no experience with mist, the twisted obligations around him would possess the power to sway him. Triumphant pulled out his dagger, straight and red as hot steel. It could slice flesh and restore the link between symbols and physical characteristics. Joe's dagger was always eating and impossible to satiate. His friend's blade was bloated and desperate for gastrointestinal relief. Triumphant ran his knife into the wall, and suddenly Joe's mind didn't see the door as just another part of the wall. They entered the long hallway. The strange patterning of the walls, what with their staggered rectangular nature, didn't register as much. To the friends, that patterning connected with the idea of smoothness, and there were no means of egress. They knew this wasn't the way the hall should be, but there had been a brief moment in which they thought they were trapped.
So, where do you think she's likely to be?
Joe shrugged.
I don't know, beats me.
You figured out what she's doing, so I know the answer isn't too far out of your reach. Stop being lazy and use your brain. Use your dagger.
You're no idiot, and my dagger doesn't possess an infinite range. Why ask me?
Because you're a slug, and I need to push you out of that.
Okay, fine. Judging by what she's doing and her choice of locations, I'd hazard that she needs a conduit to carry out her goals, a landmark with a strong connection to the English language. Perhaps different parts of the manor offer different degrees of connection, like an office or a library?
Triumphant smiled.
I knew you had it in you. Now we just need...
There it was again, that feeling of calcification in the throat, that release of baggage. The feeling subsided, and they glanced at each other.
The tour guide is employed here. He'll point us in the right direction.
He left. With Triumphant no longer watching, now would be the perfect time to dash. Wouldn't need to worry about staring Triumphant in the eye, about facing his disappointment and hurt, and Joe could ignore any attempted calls. Triumphant could handle this situation, and he would ultimately stop caring about...
One of Gage's office is through the door closet to that corner. And the library, it's in the basement.
Triumphant indicated the door in question, and then began dismantling Jane's distortion, dragging his red-hot dagger across the walls. There didn't appear to be any security personnel. That was probably because Jane had twisted their symbol characteristic connections. But although the friends couldn't recognize them, why weren't pieces of wall and floor shifting and trying to stop Jane? The potential answer scared Joe too much to consider. Now that their brains were properly pattern matching, Triumphant and Joe pressed up against the wall on either side of the door. Eyes set. They drew their blades.
You ready to become famous?
Let's do this.
Triumphant barged into the study as if he were throwing someone to the ground. The stony, mossy appearance of the manor's exterior had encroached into this room. It was as if a circle of hills surrounded Gage's study, but only half of their slopes could be seen within the space. Directly ahead, there sat an escritoire, or rather a slab of stone sculpted just enough to sort of form one. To the left and right of the escritoire, tomes were slotted into crannies chiseled into the walls. There was a single, small window, light filtering through and joining the meager illumination of sconces scattered about the walls. Tapestries hanging from the ceiling depicted miniature scenes innumerable. Jane stood by the secretaire, but she wasn't wearing her coal-colored coat. It hung on her shoulder, the same one she was glancing past at Joe and Triumphant. Her brow glistened with sweat, and beads rolled down her face. Her breathing laborious as if she had just finished sprinting. There was a tome on the secretaire, scooped from a nearby ledge, slashed and stabbed, a ragged mess of paper and torn leather, as if a dog had gotten a hold of it.
So, you two are as gifted as I am, and you can use your blades competently. Good.
Triumphant pointed his dagger at Jane.
Bring it on.
She glanced at Joe and smiled when he remained motionless.
You don't seem too enthused. Perhaps you should join me.
Yeah, I'm good.
You two are the same way I used to be, out of sync with my dagger. I didn't enjoy the way it whispered to me, and got in my head. So my response was rebellion, an intense desire to demonstrate that the dagger and I were two different entities. Then I came to realize that these daggers are extensions of the wielder. They are a piece of you that has splintered and assumed a physical form.
The woman wiped her brow.
The reasoning behind the fragmentation differs between wielders, but if the powers are the same, then that means there are similarities. I could guide you, Brother of Mist, and through our example, you could learn more about yourself, Brother of Flame. I could guide you to out of your denial and towards the true way you must satisfy your daggers.
Joe raised a brow at this intriguing offer. Maybe Jane had the answers that would finally allow him to stab himself in the gut.
Get it together, man!
That's right. He needed to remember Triumphant. His friend had a dream, and since it required Joe, his personal desires weren't important. Joe pointed his dagger at Jane, that foul criminal, too arrogant to turn around.
I can't join up with scum. Let's go, Triumphant.
Triumphant jabbed his dagger forward, and it halted as if it had embedded into a solid object. The typical person went about their life denying deep truths or failing to understand that which was before them. Triumphant could bring this out of hiding, blast the target's mind with raw realization, cripple them just as badly as if they were under the influence of countless misconnected patterns. This power reached from the point Triumphant had plunged his blade, a plexus of fissures spreading across the ground, ceiling, and floor. This shell encompassed all but the woman responsible for the language maladies, a shielding carapace.
It's your turn!
Joe's joints were rusted, his muscles attenuated. For him, running was analogous to twisting a wheel that hadn't been oiled in years. But his friend said he must, and so the corroded metal groaned and complained as Joe put his entire weight into turning it.
What are you?
Joe slashed at his opponent, but Jane caught his wrist and twisted his arm, causing his grip on his blade to fail. The woman cut Joe. In that brief span of time, Joe felt an intrusion, but he didn't experience any erroneous symbol characteristic connections. She threw Joe to the ground. With one man down, Jane scooped the tome from the secretaire and slashed it. From that swipe, blossoms of pain, tracheal grasping for the friends, and for Jane, the facial expression of a person who had been punched in the stomach. It was so sudden and unexpected, Triumphant's barrier faltered. Neither of the friends thought it was possible for Plan to play with their pattern recognition without first shattering the barrier. The opening was enough for Plan to scatter spheres of mist all about the room, and then she ran past Triumphant, slashing and pushing while he was still dazed. Weights had been tied to Plane's body, bowing her, yet the fact that she shrugged this off was a testament to her expertise. She had trained at length. Due to the cloud of mist, Schmoe and Triumphant had at first interpreted the room as equal to an extremely bright light. But with time, this transitioned into a different interpretation. The floor was a pile of lethal serpents, and the ceiling was a tangle of deadly centipedes. The pair remembered how the room used to appear, yet this memory did not dull the terror that rose within them. Schmoe scrambled to his feet, right on Triumphant's heels as they retreated, and slammed the door shut behind him. They left shortly after playing, but saw no traces of her, and the appearance of the hallway now connected to a different set of symbols and ideas. Triumphant and Schmoe swore they were standing in a long, twisting, turning hall of mirrors. The texture of the stone, that pattern of beams pushed out and in, to them, these were the way distorted reflections appeared. It was a masterful aberration of their pattern matching capabilities, and their opponent had popped this off rapidly. Although their interpretation of the hall was a disaster, nothing was out of the ordinary about their pattern recognition when it came to how they interpreted each other. How was this sensible? For they had made contact with the stranger's dagger. What was the purpose of those cuts?
Whew. She really put in a lot more effort than last time. Dismantling something of this caliber will be difficult.
He slipped his finger through the loop at the bottom of his dagger. Triumphant twirled the dagger for a few seconds. When he stopped, it now had multiple blades. He swung, twirled, and swung, launching blades to the walls. From where they hit, they sent out cascading ripples that resulted in a hodgepodge of pattern matching, partly the incorrect mirror interpretation, and partly the stone wonderland.
Schmoe! Why would you run in there so stupidly?
Schmoe held his hand out, and his dagger materialized on his palm.
I'm no expert.
So your training was all a lie? Huh?
Yep.
God damn it! How are we supposed to defeat her? She's better than both of us! Combined!
I can't answer that question. Maybe she has a point.
About what?
The whole denying thing. Maybe we should change what we're after.
Schmoe glanced at Triumphant.
What are you denying?
Don't listen to that bitch. This is our opportunity to become famous.
Another tsunami of lignification hit the pair before Triumphant could finish dismantling what Plane had built. Triumphant gnashed his teeth. Unfortunately, there was no increasing the speed at which he deconstructed, for he had already been at his maximum. Once the pair could tell where they were, Triumphant led the way down the staircase. The basement library was a large, open space, tomes lining the perimeter walls top to bottom. Tome cabinets were also organized in discrete squares that started large and withered as they approached the middle. There was no way one woman could read this much. A large amount had to be decorations. Each square had gaps at their cardinal directions, straight line paths connecting perimeter to middle. The central square challenged this pattern, possessing only one opening, that which pointed toward the basement entrance. No tomes occupied this central square. Instead, sundry baubles, paintings, and pictures populated the ledges, a pseudo-room inside a bigger room. Numerous tables and plush couches were within this middle area, sinistral and dextral, due to the straight line path. Schmoe and Triumphant saw these physical characteristics, but rather than register in a library, they thought they were staring at a distant relic, their sophomore year chemistry classroom. Schmoe grimaced yet could not turn away, intrigued yet nauseated in equal measure. Triumphant, on the other hand, regarded this classroom with a slightly raised brow.
I want to cooperate with you two, so it's best that I supply a choice.
It was indiscernible, the sound's source.
To do this, I analyzed your symbology, the essences I could rob or twist to my gain. This is what I came up with. Sit down so I can assuage your pains.
Triumphant brandished his blade.
Oh, this is a trap.
Schmoe sat in an empty seat.
Still under the impression that this is a trap? Well, I caught your buddy. But as you can see, nothing happened.
Many seconds passed, and then Triumphant approached Schmoe and sat beside him. He didn't rest against the chair's rear. He was poised, ready to respond to an ambush.
Now what?
Your pal.
Triumphant turned his eyes toward Schmoe. His grimace had deepened, and he didn't appear to be there.
Hey, what's the matter?
Always in a daze when around you. He didn't understand why, because he neglected to put aside time to ponder. Now, contemplation has been thrust upon him.
Triumphant glared at Plane.
Not you.
He then patted Schmoe.
Hey, come on. What's up? What's wrong?
Your pushing isn't new, but this time Schmoe is under the impression that you will lose without his participation. This produced abnormal pressure, and this imagery was the last push he needed to cross the line.
Would you be quiet?
The way Schmoe matched sensory data to internal symbols changed at a rapid pace. Class was in session, and then it wasn't, and then he was at lunch, and then he was traipsing through the halls, school days numbering in the hundreds, played in sequence. There was always a wide berth between him and the other students, and they tried their hardest to maintain that distance. Schmoe would stare at them, addled. How was he supposed to cross the sword? What did he say upon completing the crossing? Why didn't they cross the sword? Why was that only his duty? They were shallow, unable to peer past the outer shell of the person within. Did he care? No, he didn't care. People was synonymous with wasted time. One day, Triumphant crossed the sword, and as time passed, Schmoe came to realize his resentment had been misguided, partly because it was entitled, but also due to a reason his current situation emblemized. Plane returned them to the classroom pattern matching error.
Is this what's been eating at you?
He rapped his buddy on the shoulder.
Always been the quiet type. But there's nothing wrong with that. Now let's put an end to this bastard. This is our claim to renown.
Do I spend time with you because I appreciate you, or is this an attempt to meet an expectation?
Schmoe turned his eyes toward Triumphant.
Is this misguided responsibility?
Misguided? I wouldn't say that. But duty does play a role. It plays a role in any good relationship. It's called loyalty. And you possess that in spades.
Schmoe held up his dagger. Triumphant drew a breath, but ultimately didn't say anything.
I'm not saying that lonesomeness is my destiny, but surely this isn't the way. I'm trying too hard. When you're with someone, you're there because you want to be, and there's always the possibility that circumstance, toxic or healthy, will send you in opposing directions.
You need to try your hardest to stay together. Tough as steel.
You don't try, it happens on its own.
Meandering isn't always the answer.
Well, I guess we can agree to disagree on that one, but there is one point that stands. It used to be natural in the beginning.
Silence. Until Plain shattered it. She straightened out their symbol recognition, and Schmoe and Triumphant registered the library the way they should. Chairs with students in them were now properly understood to be empty, and one student was now properly understood to be Plain. Her denim coat was on a table, and she held a tome, reading, dragging her dagger across the pages, eager to impale.
Schmoe, did your relationship begin diminishing around when this twin daggers obsession began?
That seems about right.
Triumphant turned his gaze away, and Plain put the tome down. Elbows on the table, she leaned toward the pair.
There's more to the story than that. Triumphant, you constantly mention renown rather than duty, which is what your dagger wants you to pursue. The mutilated relationship between the blade and the man impacts your mood and how you interact with Schmoe.
She stood.
It must be addressed. Unite with me. Us three. We will operate in a constant destruction and construction cycle with language as our playground. It is the only way we will be content.
Constant and content cancel when uttered in the same breath.
You say this because content's meaning escapes you. A person can't sit idly. People are most relaxed when they are reaching, grasping, pursuing a target.
But you decide to destroy a museum rather than selecting another method. Your close connection to your dagger is hampering your ability to critically deliberate. It's best to maintain distance.
And end up in the same state as you and Schmoe? Right now, I need a conduit to carry out this consumption. But once my talents grow, I won't require that. What I'm doing right now is temporary.
Temporary? These tomes you're destroying are rare.
They're only tomes.
And you're only one person.
There is an enormous distinction between the unhappiness associated with a ruined museum and the agony that comes with my dagger haunting me due to the improper handling. And I'm not alone. There's you, Schmoe, and many others with blades. Some let their daggers lead them into trouble. Others ignore them. Almost none possess tranquil connections. I can bring about harmony through destruction on a nanoscopic scale. Come on, it's time to unite. Why would I lead a brother astray?
Because you're not trustworthy.
Triumphant gazed at his buddy, who was slouching and staring at the ground.
But I see now, this is putting quite the strain on you. Schmoe, you decide.
Schmoe's mouth twitched, and his brow was restless. He stepped in the opposite direction, and then he brandished his blade. Triumphant stared at him, perplexed, struggling to understand.
What are you doing?
Triumphant trailed away, his mouth opening wide as the pieces snapped together.
Oh, now I see.
The pals charged down the empty aisle, comparable to idiots. Plain swung her dagger, and the blade expanded rapidly. Connections between symbols and characteristics were instantly twisted. Their progress halted. They didn't want to crash into the wall which had suddenly appeared ahead. But the instinctual, emotional punch was transitory. They were aware that this was a lie. The pals rushed ahead, passing through the wall into a watery, rippling sensory cacophony. They retreated immediately,
dazed by the perplexing onslaughts.
An arm shot through the wall, grabbing Schmoe as he pulled away. He tried to dislodge the grip, but another hand succeeded the antecedent, and it held the dagger, straight through the heart, destroying something within him that he despised. It was similar to the sensation associated with losing a letter, minus the throat clenching, the stricture on speech. It was only now that Schmoe realized such a thing was possible, and it made him smile.